The railroad foreman didn't look at Lillian Hart when he told her to gather her things. He kept his eyes on the manifest, pencil moving down the column of names like he was crossing off spoiled meat. "You're done," he said. Her trunk hit the gravel before the train finished braking. Then her bedroll. Then a cloth sack with a day's worth of bread, already hard at the edges. The maintenance siding stretched empty in both directions. Just wooden platforms and rust-stained snow. No station. No town. No one. Lillian stood with her back to the wind, face turned toward where the foreman's voice had been. She couldn't see him anymore. Couldn't see the train or the other workers watching from the kitchen car windows. Couldn't see anything but the dark that had settled in 3 days ago and refused to lift. "Don't wander near the tracks," the foreman called as the engine hissed back to life. "Liability." The train pulled away. The sound grew thin, then distant, then nothing. She didn't move until the cold started biting through her coat. It had been coal dust. That's all. The kind that got into everything when you worked the line kitchens, feeding crews that laid track through empty country. It worked into your clothes, your food, the corners of your mouth. And sometimes, if you were unlucky, under your eyelid. Lillian had rinsed it with boiled water. Kept working. Stirred beans and baked biscuits and served men who didn't look at her face. The railroad didn't stop for discomfort, and she knew better than to complain. When her vision started blurring, she'd mentioned it once. The foreman said she was tired. When the swelling came, he said she was slowing the crew. When the infection spread and the light began to fade, he stopped speaking to her entirely. She'd been useful until she wasn't. Now she stood alone at a siding that didn't exist on any passenger map, with a trunk she couldn't see and no idea which direction led anywhere that mattered. Lillian crouched slowly, hands out, until her fingers found the iron rail. It was cold enough to burn. She pulled her sleeve down over her palm and touched it again. There was a faint hum in the metal, a vibration so slight it felt like a memory. Somewhere far off, a train was moving. Not hers. Not coming back. She ran her hand along the rail until she found the edge, the seam where it bolted to the next section. Then she stood and started walking. One hand on the iron. One foot in front of the other. She counted the ties beneath her boots, listened for the scrape of her sleeve against the rail, felt for the grade of the land. The wind came from the left, steady and bitter. She kept it there and kept moving. There was no plan. No destination. Just the faint logic that the tracks led somewhere, and anywhere was better than freezing on a platform no one would check until spring. Her fingers went numb first. Then her feet. The bread stayed in the sack because she didn't want to stop long enough to eat. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding how completely she'd been thrown away. So she walked. The sun crossed overhead, invisible but warm on her right cheek, then her back, then her left. She didn't know how far she'd gone. Distance lost meaning when you couldn't see the horizon. By the time her legs started shaking, the wind had shifted. It came from behind now, pushing her forward, and she didn't have the strength to wonder if that was mercy or coincidence. She kept walking until her knees buckled. Then she knelt there beside the tracks, fingers raw and bleeding, face turned up toward a sky she'd never see again. Jonah Wells moved through the snow like something that belonged there. Low and quiet, checking trap lines he'd set 2 days before. The country north of the railroad grade ran empty most of the year. Just pine, stone, and cold. He preferred it that way. He wasn't expecting to find a woman kneeling in the middle of nowhere with her hands torn open. At first he thought she was praying. Then he saw the blood on her fingers, the way her face stayed fixed on nothing, the trunk sitting 20 yards back like it had been dropped from height. He stopped 10 feet away. "You hurt." She didn't turn. Didn't even flinch. Her voice came out steady, tired. Not in a way you can fix. Jonah studied her. The railroad coat, too thin for the season. The way she held herself still, like moving cost something. The empty focus of her eyes. "You'll freeze out here," he said. "I know." He looked past her, down the tracks toward the siding. No smoke. No voices. No crew working on repairs. They'd left her then. Put her off and moved on. "Can you walk?" "I've been walking." "Can you walk more?" She was quiet for a moment, hands still resting on the rail like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Then she nodded once. Jonah moved closer, slow enough that his boots crunched warning in the snow. He touched her elbow lightly. She stood unsteady but upright, and let him guide her hand to his shoulder. "There's a trunk," she said. "I see it." He brought her to the trunk first, let her verify it by touch. Then he shouldered it and took her elbow again. They moved north, away from the tracks, her steps careful and his match to hers. He didn't rush, didn't pull, just waited when she needed to stop and started again when she was ready. The cabin sat above the creek, built into the hillside with its back to the wind. Smoke-stained logs, a single window, a door that hung crooked but closed tight. He'd wintered there 3 years running, and it had never felt small until now. Inside, he set the trunk down and guided her to the bunk. "Sit." She sat. Jonah built up the fire, filled the kettle, and set it to boil. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer explanations, just moved through the space like he always did, except slower, and said where he was going before he went there. "Stoves to your left. Bunks behind you. I'm at the table." She nodded, hands folded in her lap, face angled toward the fire's warmth. He made coffee and put a cup in her hands. She drank it black and didn't complain. When he unwrapped the bread from her sack, it was hard enough to break teeth. He soaked it in hot water until it softened, then set the bowl on her knee. "Eat." She did. Slowly, like she wasn't sure it would stay down. Jonah watched her from across the cabin, trying to make sense of what he'd agreed to. He ran traplines for pelts, sold them twice a year, and spoke to maybe 4 people between September and April. His supplies were counted for 1. His space was built for 1. And winter was just starting. She finished the bread and set the bowl aside. "You don't have to keep me. Didn't say I would. Then why bring me here?" Jonah poured himself coffee and sat back down. "Couldn't leave you on the tracks." "Why not?" He didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, but it wasn't one he wanted to say out loud. So he stood and pulled a blanket from the chest, draped it over her shoulders, and stepped back. "You take the bunk," he said. "I'll take the floor." She didn't argue. Winter came down hard that first week. Snow piled against the cabin door until Jonah had to shoulder it open each morning, and the wind found every gap in the logs. The creek below froze solid enough to walk on, though he didn't recommend it. Lillian learned the cabin by necessity. She counted steps. 5 from the bunk to the table. 7 from the table to the stove. 3 from the stove to the door. She memorized the creak in the floorboard near the water barrel, the way the door scraped when it opened, the particular rattle of the coffee pot when it was nearly empty. Jonah watched her navigate the space with her hands out, fingertips brushing walls and furniture, and tried to stay out of her way. He wasn't used to announcing himself, wasn't used to speaking much at all, but silence became dangerous when she couldn't see him coming. So he learned to warn her. "At the stove," he'd say before crossing behind her. "By the door. Coming in." She never thanked him, just nodded and adjusted, hands finding the table edge or the back of the chair. She didn't ask for help unless she needed it, and even then she asked once and remembered the answer. By the second week she was cooking. Jonah came in from checking traps to find her at the stove, one hand on the pot handle, the other held flat above the surface to gauge the heat. She stirred slowly, methodically, her face tilted toward the smell. "Beans," she said. "And something else. Onion, maybe. Dried venison." "Thought so." He set his rifle by the door and knocked snow from his boots. The cabin smelled better than it had in years. You didn't have to. Neither did you. Fair enough. She served him a bowl and took one for herself, sitting across the table in the spot she'd claimed as hers. They ate without talking. The only sound was the scrape of spoons and the pop of sap in the fire. "How far are we from the tracks?" she asked eventually. "Mile. Maybe less." "And the nearest town?" 15 miles south. 20 if the pass is snowed in." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. "You go often." "Twice a year." "Sell pelts." "Buy supplies." "When's the next trip?" "April. Maybe March if the thaw comes early." She was quiet for a long time after that, her spoon resting against the bowl's edge. Jonah didn't press. He'd learned she thought before she spoke, weighed things he couldn't see her weighing. "I can't pay you," she said finally. "Not now. Maybe not ever. Didn't ask you to." "Then what do you want?" He looked at her across the table, this woman the railroad had discarded like a broken tool, and realized he didn't have an answer. He hadn't thought past getting her out of the cold. Hadn't planned for what came after. "Don't know yet," he said. She almost smiled. Honest, at least. The days folded into each other after that. Jonah ran his traplines, checked snares, brought back what he could. Lillian kept the cabin, cooked, mended his spare shirt when the elbow tore. She moved carefully but not cautiously, learning the rhythms of the space, the sounds that meant weather or animals or nothing at all. He started describing things without realizing he was doing it. Rabbit in the second snare. Fox tracks near the creek. Snow's coming. Can smell it. Coffee's low. I'll stretch it. She listened and filed it away, building a map of the world she couldn't see. And slowly, without either of them deciding it, the cabin stopped feeling temporary. Outside, the wind howled and the temperature dropped. Inside, the fire burned steadily. It wasn't comfort, but it was something closer than either of them had known in a long time. By the third week, Lillian could navigate the cabin in full dark. Not that it mattered. Dark was all she had now. But Jonah noticed the way she moved with more certainty, less hesitation. Her hands found what they needed without searching. She learned the kettle's voice. The way it hummed low when the water was warming, then climbed to a thin whistle just before it boiled. She pulled it off the heat at exactly the right moment, every time. "How do you know?" Jonah asked one morning, watching her pour without spilling a drop. "Pitch changes. Same as everything else." He thought about that while he laced his boots. The way she'd turned the cabin into a series of sounds and textures, a place she could hold in her mind completely. He'd lived here 3 years and never noticed half of what she described. "Storm's building," he said, standing. "I'm running the north line before it hits." "How long?" 3 hours. Maybe 4. She nodded, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "I'll keep the fire up." He almost stayed. The clouds had that heavy look, the kind that dropped snow fast and didn't stop. But the traps wouldn't check themselves, and they needed every pelt he could bring in. "Bar the door after me," he said. "I will." He left her there, small and still at the table, and tried not to think about what would happen if he didn't make it back. The storm caught him 2 hours out. It came sideways, wind-driven and blinding. Jonah checked the last 3 traps by feel, his fingers too numb to work the springs properly. 1 snare was empty. 1 had frozen solid. The third held a marten, stiff and dusted white. He reset what he could and turned back. The wind erased his tracks as fast as he made them. He kept the slope on his right, the creek somewhere below, and counted paces to keep from circling. His face burned with cold. His lungs ached. The rifle on his shoulder felt like it weighed 50 pounds. By the time he saw the cabin, the light in the window was the only proof the world still had edges. He shouldered through the door and Lillian was there, reaching for him before he could speak. "Boots," she said. Get them off. He was shaking too hard to argue. She guided him to the chair, knelt, and unlaced his boots with quick, sure hands. Then his coat. Then she pressed a cup of something hot into his grip and wrapped a blanket over his shoulders. Drink. He drank. It was coffee, or what passed for it after they'd stretched the grounds too thin. But it was hot, and that was all that mattered. She stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder. Not holding. Just there. I heard the wind change an hour ago. Thought you might not make it. Almost didn't. But you did. He nodded, feeling returning to his fingers in painful increments. The cabin was warm. Too warm, maybe. She'd been feeding the fire heavy, burning through what they'd need later. But he didn't say anything. Just sat there and let the shaking pass. When he could stand again, he checked his traps. One marten. Not much, but it was something. He'd scrape and stretch it tomorrow after the storm passed. Lillian had already started dinner. Beans again, with a piece of salt pork shaved thin to make it last. She worked at the stove with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and Jonah realized he'd stopped worrying about her burning herself or cutting a finger. She'd learned the space better than he knew it. You didn't have to waste the wood, he said. Wasn't wasted. We'll run short. Then we'll run short. She ladled beans into his bowl and set it down. Better than you freezing on the hill. He looked at her across the table. This woman he'd found dying beside the tracks, who now kept him alive in return, and felt something shift that he didn't have words for. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, they ate in silence. January came in hungry. The cold settled deep and wouldn't break. Jonah's traplines yielded less each week. Animals denayed up or moved on, and he couldn't blame them. He ranged farther, stayed out longer, and came back with half what he'd hoped for. The supplies they'd stretched through December were showing bone. Coffee was gone first. Then the salt pork. The flour sack went flat, and the beans rattled lonely in their tin. Jonah started boiling pine needles for something hot to drink, and Lillian didn't complain about the taste. They cut their meals to 2 a day, then to 1.5. Neither of them said the word rationing, but that's what it was. How much is left? Lillian asked one morning, her hands wrapped around a cup of pine water. Jonah took stock in his head. 2 weeks of beans if we're careful. Dried venison for another week after that. Flowers done. And after, I'll hunt. In this cold. Don't have a choice. She was quiet, her face turned toward the sound of wind scraping the walls. How far is the town? Too far. Passes snowed shut until March, maybe later. And you can't go around? Not in this. I'd die before I made it halfway. She nodded slowly, accepting what he'd already accepted. They were locked in until spring, and spring was a long way off. That afternoon, Jonah checked the snares close to the cabin. He didn't like leaving her alone for more than an hour now. The cold was vicious, and if the fire went out or she got hurt, there'd be no coming back from it. He found one snare sprung and empty. Tracks in the snow, fox, maybe, or a marten too clever for its own good. The other 2 were frozen solid. He reset them and headed back. Inside, Lillian had reorganized the food stores. The beans were divided into small portions, each one wrapped in cloth. The venison was sorted by size. Everything counted, everything planned. 14 days, she said when he came in. If we eat once a day and keep the portion small. That's not enough. It's what we have. He wanted to argue, but she was right. You couldn't eat what wasn't there. He hung his coat and sat down heavily, the exhaustion reaching deeper than his bones. Lillian moved to the stove, measuring out their single meal with the precision of someone who'd cooked on the railroad, where waste meant trouble and trouble meant the line. She made the beans stretch with boiled water, thickened it with a last scraping of flour, and served him a portion that was bigger than hers. Same size, he said. Yours is the same as yesterday. Lillian. You're running traplines. I'm sitting inside. You need it more. He wanted to push back, but the logic was sound and they both knew it. So he ate what she gave him and tried not to think about how light her bowl looked. The days compressed into a kind of endurance neither of them named. Jonah's trap stayed empty more often than not. The cold sank claws into everything. They burned less wood to make it last, and the cabin stayed just warm enough to keep the water from freezing. Lillian stopped asking how much food was left. Jonah stopped telling her. They moved slower, spoke less, saved energy the way they saved everything else. One night, Jonah woke to the sound of her breathing, shallow and tight, like her ribs couldn't expand all the way. He lay on the floor in the dark and listened, waiting to see if it would even out. It didn't. You all right? He asked quietly. Fine. She wasn't. He could hear it. But there was nothing to do about it except keep going. In the morning she was up before him, rationing out their portion like nothing had changed. They ate in silence. Outside, the snow kept falling. February arrived with no ceremony and no relief. Jonah's hands shook when he worked the traplines now. Not from cold alone, though that was part of it, but from the hollow feeling that had settled in his chest and wouldn't leave. Hunger had teeth, and it was starting to bite. He brought back a rabbit on the 8th. Lillian made it last 3 days, boiling the bones twice for broth, picking the meat down to nothing. They drank the broth hot and pretended it was filling. On the 14th, he checked 16 traps and found them all empty. He came back to the cabin with nothing, his legs weak, his vision swimming at the edges. Lillian was sitting at the table, hands folded, face turned toward the door like she'd been waiting. Anything? She asked. No. She nodded. No disappointment in her expression. No fear. Just acceptance. There's enough for tonight. Maybe tomorrow. And then we see what comes. He sat down across from her, too tired to take his coat off. I can go farther out. There's a country to the east I haven't tried. How far? Day and a half. Maybe 2. You won't make it back. I might. Jonah. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him cold. You won't make it back. Not in this cold. Not without food. He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her he'd done harder things, survived worse odds. But the truth was sitting right there between them, and they both knew it. She reached across the table, her hand searching until it found his. Her fingers were thin now, the bones too close to the surface. We've done what we could. It's not enough. It's what we have. That night they ate the last of the beans. Lillian served them plain, no water to stretch them, no pretending there'd be more tomorrow. They chewed slowly and didn't speak. Afterward, Jonah lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling. The fire burned low. The wind rattled the door. And somewhere in the dark, Lillian's breathing was too shallow again. He didn't sleep. Morning came gray and soft. Jonah forced himself up, laced his boots and checked the closest snares. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, distant and uncooperative. But he went anyway, because staying still was the same as giving up. The first 2 snares were empty. The third held a grouse, frozen stiff but intact. He stood there in the snow, staring at it like it might disappear. Then he reset the snare with shaking hands and carried the bird back. Lillian heard him come in. Anything. Grouse. Her face changed. Not quite a smile, but close. Relief, maybe, or something like hope. I'll make it last. She did. Roasted it slowly over the fire, saved the fat, and boiled the bones. They ate a portion that night and stretched the rest over 2 more days. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the edge off the worst of the hunger. On the 20th, the wind shifted. Jonah noticed it first, how it came from the south now instead of the north, how it carried a different weight. The temperature didn't rise, not yet, but the quality of the cold changed. Softer. Wetter. Spring's coming, he said. Lillian tilted her head, listening. How long? Weeks. Maybe a month. Will we make it? He looked at her across the cabin, thin and tired and still upright, still fighting. We'll make it. She nodded, and for the first time in weeks, he believed it. The traps began to yield again. Not much, but steady. A rabbit here, a squirrel there. Lillian made everything count, and they stopped losing ground. The snow melted in patches. The creek began to move beneath the ice, a low rumble they could feel through the floor. And slowly, carefully, they started to breathe again. March brought the thaw, and with it, the sound of breaking. Ice cracked in the trees at night, sharp as gunfire. The creek woke up angry, chewing through its banks, swallowing snow and deadfall. Water ran everywhere. Down the hill under the cabin, across ground that had been frozen solid for months. Jonah stood outside one morning and listened to the world come apart. It's early, he said when he came back in. Too early. Lillian was at the stove, coaxing heat from damp wood. That bad? The creek's running high. If it keeps up, the railroad bed'll flood. She paused, her hands still on the kettle. The tracks. Maybe. He didn't say what they both understood, that the tracks were the only connection to anything resembling civilization, the only route to town, the only way out if things went wrong. For 3 days the water rose. Jonah watched it climb the banks, thick with mud and debris. The sound was constant now, a low roar that drowned out everything else. He moved their woodpile higher up the hill and dug a trench to divert runoff from the cabin door. On the 4th day, the railroad bed gave way. He heard it happen, a deep groan, then a crash that echoed up through the valley. He went down to see, moving carefully on ground that had turned to mud and loose stone. The rails were twisted like rope. Ties scattered across the wash, some driven into the hillside, others carried downstream and lodged against rocks. A section of grade had collapsed entirely, leaving a gap 20 feet wide where iron and timber used to be. The line was gone. Jonah stood there a long time, looking at the wreckage. No train would pass through here for months. Maybe longer, depending on how fast the railroad wanted to rebuild a stretch that didn't serve anywhere important. They were cut off now. Truly cut off. When he came back to the cabin, Lillian was waiting by the door. She'd heard the collapse, felt it through the ground. How bad? Bad. Rails are twisted. Grades washed out. Can they fix it? Eventually. But not soon. She absorbed that in silence, her face unreadable. Then she asked the question he'd been avoiding. Can we get to town another way? Overland, maybe. But it's a rough country, and the ground's soft. We'd have to wait for it to dry. How long? Month. Maybe more. She turned back toward the cabin, one hand trailing along the doorframe. Then we wait. But Jonah could hear something in her voice. Not fear exactly, but a kind of understanding. The world had made its choice. The railroad that had used her and discarded her was gone now, erased by the same indifferent forces that had brought them together. That night, they sat by the fire and listened to the water. It was quieter now, the worst of the flood, but still present. Still moving. We could go, Jonah said eventually. When the ground dries. Follow the old hunting trail south. Be in town by April. Lillian was quiet for a long time, her hands wrapped around a cup of pine tea. And then what? Get supplies. Come back if you want. Or. He trailed off, not sure how to finish. Or I could stay in town, she said. Find work. Try to make a life there. You could. She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear. The water, maybe. Or the wind. Or the particular silence that came after disaster, when the world rearranged itself and waited to see what would grow in the empty spaces. "I can't see," she said quietly. "Can't work the line. Can't do most things people need done in towns. There's other work. Charity work. Pity work." She set the cup down. "I know what I'd be there for. And here," she smiled, small and sad, "here I'm just blind. Not useless. Not broken. Just blind." April came soft and slow, the ground firming under a string of clear days. The creek settled into its banks, still high but no longer wild. Green pushed up through the mud, grass first, then wildflowers Jonah had never bothered to notice before. He described them to Lillian while they worked outside, hanging pelts to dry in the sun. Yellow ones by the creek. Little white clusters near the wood line. Columbine. Maybe. Don't know about flowers. Describe the white ones. Small. 5 petals. Grow in bunches. Yarrow probably. She smiled slightly. My mother used to make tea from it. They worked in silence after that, the sun warm on their backs. Jonah had enough pelts now to make the trip to town worthwhile. Good ones, too, marten and fox, stretched and scraped properly. They'd bring enough to restock supplies and see them through to fall. He could leave next week. The trail was clear. The weather was holding. He hadn't mentioned it yet. That evening, they sat outside on the bench he'd built from scrap lumber. The air smelled like pine and thawed earth. Somewhere down the valley, a bird called, and another answered. "Town's about a week out," Jonah said. "The trail's dry enough now." Lillian nodded, her face turned toward the last of the sunlight. "You'll sell the pelts?" "That's the plan. And come back." He looked at her, at the way she held herself so still, like she was braced for something. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're here when I get back." She was quiet for a long time. Down below, the creek murmured over stones. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. "I don't need the railroad anymore," she said finally. "Don't need what it promised. Wages. A future. All of that. What do you need?" She turned toward him, her eyes focused on nothing and everything. "This. The sound of water. The way the sun feels in the afternoon. Knowing where I am without having to see it. That's not much. It's enough." She paused, hands folded in her lap. "Is it enough for you?" Jonah thought about the years he'd spent alone, running traps and keeping quiet, never needing anything beyond what he could carry. He thought about the way the cabin had changed with her in it. The smell of cooking, the sound of her voice, the strange comfort of knowing someone else was breathing in the dark. "Yeah," he said. "It's enough." She smiled then, real and soft. "Then I'll be here." He left 3 days later with the pelts bundled on his back and a list of supplies in his head. Flour, beans, coffee, salt, needles and thread, lamp oil. The things they needed to make it through another year. Lillian walked him to the creek, one hand on his arm. 2 weeks, he said. "I'll count them." He kissed her forehead, quick and awkward, neither of them practiced at such things, and headed south down the trail. When he looked back, she was still standing there, face turned toward the sound of his footsteps, one hand raised in farewell. The trip took 9 days. When he came back, she was in the garden plot they'd started, hands in the dirt, planting seeds she'd navigate by touch and memory. She heard him coming and stood, brushing soil from her hands. "Jonah." "I'm here." She crossed the distance between them without hesitation, and he caught her, solid and real. No wages. No schedule. No train coming to reclaim either of them. Just work reshaped to fit and a life that moved at the speed they could keep. The creek ran clear below. The wind moved through the pines. And they stayed. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales from the Wild West. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about survival, second chances, and finding home in unexpected places. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.